welcome to the First Stride Podcast, your weekly dose of conservative news brought to you by Restoration of America. I'm your host, Hayden Ludwig, Research Director for Restoration News. Be sure to find our work at restoration-news.com. This week, we're joined by Robert Tyler, founder and president of Advocates for Faith and Freedom, the nation's bulwark against the secular leftists undermining the First Amendment. Bob, thanks for joining the show.
Good to be with you.
So let's start off by talking a little bit about your organization. Tell us what Advocates for Faith and Freedom is all about.
We started our organization out here in California, the upcoming swing state here in the near future, I hope. We started our organization. Yeah, that's optimism for you. We started back in 2002 is actually when we started, and we're a nonprofit organization. We focus on religious liberty and First Amendment issues, and we take on cases, many of them here in California, where, I think I used to say that everything that starts in California gets exported to the rest of the country and the rest of the world. So we're here in the battleground and doing what we can to try to preserve our First Amendment liberties, our religious liberty, and life as we knew it at one point in time in this country.
I am one of those exports, by the way, California native, long since become an expat, so very close to my heart. Let's talk about one of your ongoing cases that caught my eye. So you guys are currently involved in a lawsuit challenging California's so-called transgender sanctuary bill. What's that all about?
That is the situation where California, of course, trying to be at the forefront of everything, created this bill so that individuals could literally traffic young people to the state of California so that they could get transgender medical treatment, various therapies, even surgery. So imagine you've got somebody who's in Arizona or Texas or Florida, or as far away as Maine, and you've got an individual and their family is, opposed to this hormone therapy and things of that nature. Not necessarily anti-transgender, as one might say, but more just, look, you're too young for this. You're 15 years old. We need to wait until you're 20 plus years old before you could, even rationally contemplate something like this. Well, that person could get with their school teacher, and their school teacher could traffic them by driving them all the way across the country into the state of California, so that student could get medical treatment here, and that student could then petition the court or go to the governing authorities and say, I need help, and then that young person could be put in foster care so that they could get the appropriate transgender treatment and therapies. It's just crazy. And so California created this law, what is this transgender sanctuary bill. And what they do is try to eliminate, and they certainly, at least within the state of California, would eliminate any prosecution of medical people, of the person who trafficked them, because that's really kidnapping. But of course, California is going to redefine what kidnapping really is. So we filed a lawsuit against the state challenging that. Unfortunately, I have to say that most recently we received a federal court ruling at the district court that our case was being dismissed. And the reason why is because it's this issue of Article 3 standing under the U.S. Constitution, that you have to be able to show that there's an actual injury. And what the court's basically saying is, look, you can't show an actual injury. We were representing an interested organization who fights for parental rights and fights for children themselves, frankly. The court says that's not enough. And effectively what the court's saying is, you're going to have to find some parent possibly from some other state whose child has been trafficked to the state of California before you have standing to be able to bring a lawsuit like this. And so we are strategizing to try to come up with a way that we might be able to head this, face this head on before an actual incident happens.
And see, it does seem that this is a theme we see in almost every issue. The left passes these terrible, malicious laws, and then they weaponize the courts against regular people. And when conservatives follow the law and challenge it in court the way we're told to, we don't get our day in court. These cases are thrown out on the most paltry excuses, like you don't have standing. So we have to let some child be trafficked, and that is the right word, to the left coast, have their body mutilated, because it's not really medical treatment, right? This is gender mutilation, puberty blockers, hormone therapy, the kind of thing that's going to stay with this person for the rest of their life, and then wait for that child to regret it enough to want to actually file a lawsuit against these people. I mean, this is just barbarism, and it seems to me that this is a form of lawfare that the left is weaponized against it. Or am I exaggerating here?
No, you're not exaggerating. The problem of it is in the court system, you have judges, and I like to place them into generally three categories. With judges that we come up against, you have the very conservative judge, and that is the judge with kind of a view from the 50s and 60s, which may be a conservative, even Reagan type appointed judge. And sometimes those judges are often so very pro-government, and they're living in the past, that sometimes they make it difficult. Then there's another category, I think, that are just purely intellectually honest judges. Those are the judges that we want, whether they're liberal, whether they're conservative. Either way, they're going to make rulings with intellectual honesty based upon precedent. And then we have those other judges often that are on the left, and they don't see precedent. They don't see the Constitution as this steadfast, long-standing document that we live by. Rather, they see it as this living and breathing document, and things can change, and they're politically swung by the winds of the day. And so we often find ourselves in this situation where we're just praying for intellectually honest judges. And I hate to say it, that a lot of times those intellectually honest judges are few and far between, because often it's the very conservative pro-government judge that's a Republican and probably has voted Republican their entire life, and then you've got the left, these judges that are appointed by Biden and Obama, the ones that we've seen these days that are too often not intellectually honest. It's hard to find those intellectually honest judges, and so this is kind of our situation where we get into federal courts, and we really have to do everything we can. And so when you talk about this contrast, yes, it seems like the left comes in and they could bring the same lawsuit we brought, but on some other different political perspective, and the court deems that they have standing, right, because they get a left-oriented type judge.
Well, we notice that the evolution of our so-called living, breathing documents only evolves in the direction of the progressive left. It never evolves in the direction of anything a traditional conservative would support.
Right. I mean, and that's the idea. Who came up with the idea that this Constitution's living and breathing? It wasn't our side. So.
Exactly. Yes. Well, let's talk about, there's the threat to the Constitution, but there's also the bigger threat to the First Amendment of the Constitution, specifically religious liberty. We've seen the attacks on freedom of speech, but I think you and I would probably both agree that freedom of religion, religious liberty, undergirds all other rights in the Constitution, including freedom of speech. If you're not allowed to believe something, if you're not allowed to express that belief, it almost doesn't really matter whether you have the right to bear arms or speak your mind or assemble in public lawfully. It's pretty obvious now, especially to older folks, that things have gotten really, really bad in this country vis-a-vis religious liberty in the past 15, 20 years. I think it's probably a longer attack than that. Bob, how did things get so bad so quickly?
Well, there's so many different dimensions to that question. I first want to affirm exactly what you're saying, that When I first became a lawyer back in 1996, I felt called by God to become a lawyer to fight for our religious liberties. Now, why? 1996, actually, I became a lawyer in 1995. Why in the world would I feel back in 95 that there was such a threat to our religious liberties? I don't know. I think it was a God thing. And so I got involved and began litigating cases and started our own organization in 2002. And so what happened? There's been a significant change at the U.S. Supreme Court that occurred from the 60s all the way into the 90s with a court that was much more moderate. Not a leftist court, but much more moderate. And even Justice Scalia, in his rulings, he ruled upon a case called the Employment Division versus Smith. And Justice Scalia wrote what really today has turned out to be, frankly, I believe, a very bad, poor ruling when it comes to the free exercise of religion. And he basically said, if you treat religion equally to all other groups, someone wants to practice their religion, any law that is, quote, neutral and generally applicable applies to the religious group. The left has used that, and I'd say the government. You've got, and even the very conservative governments, and then you have even the left, and they would say, look, we're applying this law that says everybody has to stay home, and no one can go out, and you cannot gather in groups, except for those particular, certain situations where it's for your own safety, like going to the hospital or going to the grocery store or going to Costco, and what ends up happening there is that this law was defended by, and obviously we're talking about COVID. And this particular law was defended saying we're not violating Justice Scalia's ruling in Employment Division versus Smith. But thankfully, we have a conservative Supreme Court who stepped in and said, wait a minute, that's not really what that doesn't, neutral and generally applicable, this test that's applied, if religious groups are being treated differently than any secular group based upon the risk associated, then that's not neutral and generally applicable. So it took a conservative Supreme Court to come back, rein that case in, and say, no, you don't treat religion, just because you're not allowing the movie theaters to stay open or the football stadiums to stay open, that doesn't give you the right to shut down churches. Because the free exercise of religion is our First Amendment liberty. There's not a First Amendment to go watch a football game in a First Amendment right to go watch a football game in a stadium full of people. Now, one might argue differently, but let's just, in comparison, going to church is not the same as going to see a football game.
Right.
And so, we made these arguments, and thankfully we see a Supreme Court now that has turned things around, and and thanks to President Trump. I mean, imagine, I'll say this to you. In 2015, I was getting so discouraged that, people always say, well, this is the most consequential election of all time. Well, it is that way, seems every time. But at this point in time, I will say the most consequential election definitely was in 2015 into 2016. And that was the most consequential because our courts were loaded with judges who were politically minded and believed the Constitution was this living, breathing document, and therefore it will change, and our First Amendment liberties and our Second Amendment liberties are not so cherished. So Trump appointed a slew of judges and on the Supreme Court. And thanks to that, whether you like Trump or not, we were blessed with now having a court that became far more balanced. I'm not saying it's, and when I say the Supreme Court definitely is in our favor, but across the board with all the district courts around the country and the courts of appeal, today we're more balanced. Joe Biden has appointed enough that is kind of getting a little bit out of balance again. But had Trump not won, I had said to myself, it is not worth me spending my entire life trying to continue to fight these cases, because I'm wasting my time and I'm wasting their donors' money, because we don't have judges who care. We don't have judges who care about our Constitution. And so thankfully, because President Trump was elected, I went into the Ninth Circuit a few weeks after his election for an argument. And I will tell you, the mood swing was entirely different. I've been in the Ninth Circuit many times arguing cases in front of these judges. This was a case where a pastor was arrested in front of the DMV for reading the Bible out loud.
That's right.
We lost in the district court to an Obama judge in Los Angeles. And we absolutely should have won based upon the First Amendment. We went in, and there was a very prominent, well-known attorney defending the state of California in this case. And I expected I was going to be grilled. But I recognized that these judges all of a sudden seemed to have the courage to be intellectually honest. And they turned the case, against this other attorney. And all I had to do was basically agree with the judges the entire time. And they were questioning this attorney and grilling him upside down. And we ended up winning the case. And it was one of these cases, it was just shocking. And I saw a sea change occur in the federal courts thanks to President Trump. And so here we are again. I'm sorry, I'm rambling, but I'm, stream of consciousness here. Hayden, what we are seeing in this next election, I'm afraid that if Joe Biden is elected again, well, let's not say if Joe Biden is appointed president again,
or some other Democrat, yes,
yeah, or someone else, then and we find ourselves in a situation where we wind up with more and more of these intellectually dishonest judges, and our courts are flooded. I feel like I might be back in the same position come 2027 into 2028, where as a lawyer I'm questioning, I don't even know that it makes sense for us to keep our organization together and continue raising funds in order to take on these consequential legal battles, because our courts will be again so flooded with leftist-oriented judges that I'm not sure that it even makes sense to continue fighting in those court settings. Now, trust me, I've been doing this for so long, and I'm not one who sits here and gives up. Everyone else who's given up on California, I'm saying, come back, don't move, get back here to California and help us. We've got to fight this battle. We got to stop these crazy laws here before they get exported to the rest of the state. So, you'll see me. I'll be the last guy on the battle line. But I'm afraid that I may be the last guy come 2027 if we don't see if we don't see President Trump getting elected again.
Well, let's also remember, Elijah and God reserving 7,000 men who've not bowed the knee to Baal, right? But I take your point. I mean, one of the things that we notice is that when God is judging a nation for its sinfulness, he gives them bad judges. He gives them bad, evil rulers. And this is something we're seeing right now. But I agree. Yes. I mean, there are millions of Christians out there, and conservatives too, who feel vindicated by taking a gamble with Donald Trump, this most unlikely of saviors of the republic, and are absolutely vindicated by that decision. I want to go back a minute, though, to something you said about Justice Scalia, this ruling, this idea that there are neutral laws that we can apply. Because I would contend that no law is neutral. Every law is an expression of public morality, right? Part of this is, I like to point out to people, secularism is not neutral. I think one of the reasons that Christians have lost so much ground is that we've caved into this left-wing idea that their ideas are the neutral ground and our ideas are some kind of partisan hostile takeover, when in reality, every time you see a rainbow flag flying over a school or a U.S. embassy, that's an indication you're being conquered here. Bob, do you sense people waking up and seeing the reality of not only how bad things are getting, but why we need to not only vote, but be aware and fight back and maybe take our kids out of government schools and pay attention and educate our families. Do you see this sort of awakening happening?
Yeah, 100%. And I'll give you some examples. In the years past, let me say probably 20 years ago, when we would be up against cases, and there were arguments in various courts that have been made in the past that secularism is a religion, that that atheism is a religion, that this concept that neutral and generally applicable laws will apply to religion, even though they are, theoretically neutral and generally applicable. So Justice Scalia writes that opinion. I don't think he recognized what he was, what he was doing. And in my view, he weaponized government to give them this opportunity to stand behind this defense. But there was a time in the past where, we made these arguments and said, hold on a minute, this concept of secularism, or what's the word we don't hear a whole lot anymore, but humanism, these humanistic ideas, and so there'd be cases, and the courts would say, no, that's not religion. You can't compare your religious practice to somebody who has no practice, or that years ago we would argue that this the transsexuality, the over-sexualization of our young people is a religious perspective. I mean, let's just go back.
It absolutely is.
It absolutely is. Abortion. This is Moloch. These are religious, paganistic practices.
Well, and let me even point out the idea of freedom of worship and liberty of conscience and freedom of speech. Those are not natural ideas that occur in all human cultures. They're an outcrop. They're a religious expression that comes only from the Bible, the Old and New Testaments. So, the idea of these secularists, their religion would never invent these ideas. They have to poach them from the Christian heritage of this country in order to use them against Christians in 2024. But I interrupted you, please.
Well, you're making the point. That is, the point is that these cases, there were cases where these arguments were raised in the past, and the courts rejected them back then. And so, I've had people, even most recently, come to me and say, can't we make an argument that this transgenderism is a religion? And I say, well, the hard thing is that there's cases in past where these kinds of arguments were made. And we lost, and the court said that's not religion. So basically, if I could say, coming down, this is an argument that's been made in the past. I think that we're finding ourselves, thankfully, with the U.S. Supreme Court's ruling during COVID, that took Justice Scalia's rulings about neutrality and general applicability and said, wait, we're not going to compare this group to another group based upon whether there's a group that is assembling or not. Okay? So it used to be that if I'm going to claim that my religious liberties are being violated, I have to be able to show that there's some other group that is a gathering of people that is not being treated the same. So I would have had to have argued that, well, they're allowing movie theaters to remain open, but they're not allowing churches to open. And we, particularly here in California, again, this is where these cases all came out of, for the most part, and one in New York during COVID. We fought back and we said, wait a minute, Costco is open, the liquor store's open, the marijuana dispensaries are open. And there are people who are gathering together and they're waiting in line, but it's not your traditional gathering. But if they're allowed, churches should be allowed to be open. And yes. The U.S. Supreme Court came back, thankfully, and said, look, the test is not whether it's another gathering that is being treated better than a religious gathering. The test is whether they are allowing secular operations to continue that have the same risk of potential COVID risk, so to speak, as a church. And so the analysis is left from one gathering to another gathering to what's the risk? Is there some greater risk that is being exposed because the church is gathering? And so now you can expand that into other areas. And so, thank God we've got a Supreme Court now that I think looks at things far more rationally.
And people need to understand, COVID, this watershed year for authoritarianism in this country, just putting it mildly, that the reaction to it was never about trusting the science. In fact, the science has largely been disproven. As of recording right now, there are new studies out talking about all the failures of stand 6 feet apart, all the failures of social distancing. And you had pastors, I think of John MacArthur's church down in Southern California that stayed open the entire time despite threats of lawsuits and massive 6-figure fines from the state of California, because they recognized, hold on, this is actually a philosophical or a theological argument that we're dealing with, not a scientific argument as guys like Dr. Fauci would have you believe. You simply cannot love your neighbor when you have to stand 6 feet apart from them. They understood that. It seems to me, too, that a lot of Americans are waking up to this reality. And, it's pretty clear from what you've told us, it's a mixed bag whether the religious liberty is better off in 2024 than it was in 2020. Let me ask you this as we part. We know the left is always innovating and thinking up the next scheme. What do you see on the horizon, Bob, that nobody in the conservative movement yet is identified or is talking about?
Oh, boy. I think that, as you said in the very beginning, and I'm going to kind of go back to this, that, without religious liberty, everything else falls apart. It's our first liberty. But we have to be able to recognize that there are other issues and liberties that we have to battle for, such as election integrity, such as the right to bear arms, the right to free speech. And as an organization, we started out originally focusing on religious liberty alone. That was my passion. But I soon recognized that, wait a minute, we've got to fight for parental rights, because they're going to pass laws that are going to eliminate our religious liberty, calling it protection of children. Next, they're going to restrict our rights to be able to have a free and fair election and everyone to have their vote count based upon election restrictions or election regulations, or everyone gets to vote. And then right now, let's talk about free speech. I was up arguing a case in downtown Los Angeles yesterday, defending a gentleman named Garrett Ziegler of Marco Polo, an organization who received a copy of the Biden laptop and exposed, primarily responsible for making this available to the public, to the media, to Congress itself. All of this information about this, what appears to be political corruption, peddling, influence that is being abused by this Biden family. And
wow.
And so I'm defending Garrett Ziegler and Marco Polo against this lawsuit brought by Hunter Biden himself, with the entire deep state behind him and all their funding. And this is just a young man who says, look, we need to expose this for what it is. And he puts it all up on the website, which, by the way, anybody who wants to go see and you want to go search the big guy and read the emails themselves, go to go to Marco Polo 501c3.org, Marco Polo 501c3.org, and you'll be able to see this. And so one of the things that I think, when you look at this and say, what are we as Americans, what are we in the conservative movement missing? I think it is this idea that there are these things that are going on around us often that we kind of plug our ears to, or say, yeah, there's some bad stuff going on. But the attack against our freedoms is now so diverse. It's in the elections. It's in the laws that are being passed. It is against our ability to bear arms. And I'm not here to say, oh my gosh, everyone should be allowed to own a machine gun. I don't know. I mean, I'm not an expert in that arena, but we've got to defend there. We have to defend on parental rights. We have to defend on free speech. We have to defend on all of these things in order to preserve that core freedom of religious freedom.
Yeah. Well, with the Hunter laptop, I mean, this is not something where we lost our freedom of speech to be able to show this information to the world overnight. We started to lose it rapidly when the country started to secularize and hold these ideas in contempt. The very idea of a living, breathing constitution means you don't actually have any rights in there. The Bill of Rights is just a suggestion that can be taken away when the regime deems it necessary. And you just look around the consequences of that. You've got a president who's, currently trying to put his opponent in prison right now, while turning the entire federal government to defend his own familial corruption right now from you and me, just from people trying to expose it out there and trying to crush Americans in the process. This is why it's so important people be involved. Bob, where can people go to learn more about Advocates for Faith and Freedom?
Hey, thanks for asking. We are at faith-freedom.com. That is www.faith-freedom.com. And we are a public, not a public interest. We are a religious corporation in California, and we take on cases to preserve our constitutional liberties, with our ultimate goal of preserving our religious freedom, to be able to share the gospel, to be able to have our free speech. And I will say that the underlying purpose for which we exist is to defend the First Amendment right to spread the gospel of Jesus Christ. And that is really the main reason why we exist. And so please come and look. There's a great case that we just had that really has hit the media today about a teacher who was sued or who was fired because she wouldn't lie to parents. And so that's out right now. Maybe we can come back and talk about that case another day, or the Hunter Biden case. But please come to our website and you'll see some pretty amazing things that our little organization is doing behind enemy lines.
Robert Tyler, amazing stuff. Thank you for all the work you're doing and for joining us on the show today. We really appreciate your time.
Thanks, Hayden. Great to be with you.
Let me thank you folks for tuning in and supporting conservative voices like Bob's working to expose the truth about the rot spreading through this once great country. Remember that it's only by working together and by praying together that we can restore the United States of America to greatness under Almighty and Sovereign God. I'm your host, Hayden Ludwig. Join us next time as the battle rages on.
First Right, a new kind of news summary without the liberal slant. Every morning, in your inbox, always free. Subscribe by texting First Right to 30161. That's First Right, all caps, one word, to 30161.